So Dr. Bernard, I know you've spent a lot of time studying the whole idea of impossible goals. I even wrote about your thinking in this book, 10x is easier than 2x. So I love the quote from Albert Einstein, imagination is more important than knowledge. How I view it is I view my future and even my past as a draft. So right now I've got a draft. I know if I get into a different state, I might even think of things right now that are different. One of the things I've been playing a lot with lately is short-term impossible goals. So as an example, even going for things that are seem to be impossible before the end of this year, before the end of 2023, or even setting, an impossible target for September and, rallying the troops, getting us excited and messing with it. And so I just wanted your opinion on short-term impossible goals, their use, maybe their misuse, how you would do it in an effective way. And you can go back and forth with me on this, but this is just something I've been exploring lately.
Imagine this as being your impact of a specific way of setting a goal. So that would be the level of performance that picking a specific number would enable you to achieve. And this is the magnitude of the goal, right? So on this axis. So this would be setting it as very low. I'm setting a goal for myself of achieving $100,000 by the end of the year versus I'm setting myself a goal of extremely high $10 million. If you think about what would be the relationship, so the impact is what you actually realize. So this would be your actual outcome. If you set the goal at that level, what would you actually achieve? If it was a completely self-fulfilling prophecy environment and you set the goal of 100K and you got 100, that outcome will look like that. That correlation will look like that. And in that type of correlation, there's no maximum number. Just your imagination will determine your actual success rate. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You go for 100,000, you'll meet 100,000. You go for 10 million.
So you're saying if you were in a vacuum environment where, anything you wanted, you got, it would be a line like that where whatever the magnitude is, you would get that output?
Yeah, if it was true always, that whatever you imagine you can achieve, then that is what this relationship would look like. Okay. And of course, this is not a linear scale; it's a logarithmic scale. So if I plotted it will look like this, right? Because this is not linear, right? But what if the curve doesn't look like this? What if the shape is more like this?
So explain it. How would it go that way?
So for me, this is most parameters in reality follow this curve. Anything that is not a goal, but a necessary condition. So a necessary condition for achieving a goal would be, what am I targeting? What is the impossible goal I'm setting for myself? And what this curve tells me is that there's free zones here. This is enough. This is too little. And this is too much. So getting back to your question, I think it's just, first of all, conceptually being aware of the fact that there will be a point where it's too much. And
how do you know that? If a goal, for example, say with money as an example, how can you say it's too much?
So we have to pay attention to our emotional state, right? So goal setting is, for me at least, is a way of putting ourselves in the emotional state of hyper-productivity, hyper-creativity. If I set a goal that's too low, I'm not going to bother. There's no fire below me that's going to get me up and going, etc. Right? I think it's realistic. I'm not going to think out of the box. But there's also this point where you know that by committing to that goal, especially if there's other people involved, right? And there's deep fears about, failure, about what if we don't succeed? Will I be blamed? Will I feel shame? There's a point where it becomes so large that it's not putting you in an emotional state that you need to be in to trigger that flow state of mind where you're hyper-productive and hyper-creative. And I think it's just at the individual level for the viewers out there, you have to trust yourself, right? It's like I challenge myself, and if I'm working with clients, I go 100,000. How excited are you? 1 million. How excited are you? Nervously excited? That to me is, for me, this level is nervously excited.
The too much level is
just nervous.
And the too little side, the emotional state,
Yeah,
it's
just
bored or what?
Like, yeah, bored, not excited, So I think it's just that it's a very individual thing. You have to be able to really feel what's the emotion that you trigger within yourself and within your team. Look at their body language, get them to tell you what are they going through at the moment, what are they feeling. If I say 1 million, what are you feeling? It's like, well, if there's a huge incentive for us to get that million, this is going to be hard. It's probably going to be the hardest thing we've ever done. But you know what? I think it might just be possible if we all committed and we can focus on this thing full out. We might just be able to do it. And if we do, we will never forget that experience. It's a story that we will tell our grandkids, right? Let's go for it. But now I go 10 million. And it's like, it's too much.
Is it, and why is it too much though? That's my question, is why is that too much?
So I think,
is it because they just genuinely don't think they can do it? Or is it because it feels like it's too hard, or they don't see the pathway? Like, for them, why does that shut them down on the emotional level?
Yeah, I think it's just the generic answer is that it's now not putting them into the right emotional state, right? And that emotional state could be, for some, it's a point where it now triggers extreme fear.
I've got 45 minutes left in Elon Musk's new biography, Walter Isaacson. I'm almost done. I finish it today, but on my audio, but he like creates fear in people. I mean, his goals are so impossible and his timelines are so unrealistic that either you are like a masochist, to be a part of what he wants to do, or you just don't. He says he doesn't believe in psychological safety. He wants things to be hardcore, and so he creates an environment where, in a culture where it's like, if you're not hardcore, then you probably shouldn't be on this team, because he doesn't believe in psychological safety. Right.
And for him, it doesn't matter, right? Because he's not triggered by those fears.
Right? And he's explicit that if you are, then you probably shouldn't be on this team.
Yeah, exactly. And that's you take all the incredible geniuses like him, and the Steve Jobs of the world, and the Bill Gates, etc. It's hard to work for these guys. Really hard, because they will push you to the brink, and unfortunately there's lots of casualties along the way. People's lives are destroyed, they have heart attacks, etc. Not everybody can cope with that. In fact, very, very few people can cope with that type of extreme, but there's enough people that can, and that's why they are able to achieve these incredible things that look impossible, is that there's enough people that can, right? And it could be because they're so scared of losing their job that they go the extra mile over and over and over again. It could be that they so admire this guy that they so want to impress him, that's the thing that drives them, to go that extra mile. So it could be fear, it could be ultimate respect, and just so keen to be loved and liked by him that they will do anything.
Well, let me just, as kind of a final thought here, and we can button this up. I mean, certainly I think there's ways to inspire your team, but I'm just thinking about myself. I'm thinking about myself here and about my own framing and my own thinking. I'm a big believer in psychology. There's a concept called selective attention. Selective attention being like, you see what you're filtering for, like if I'm looking for, there's kind of a parable that says, like, a man is so busy looking for bronze coins that he misses the gold ones that are sitting right there. So we get what we're filtering for. And then so in large part, I'm thinking to myself, if I filtered something differently, if I was filtering for something that right now I might think is impossible, maybe I'll start seeing and finding that there's all those opportunities around me, and I wouldn't have noticed them because I thought they were impossible, or because I wasn't filtering for them. So I'm just kind of thinking like, what actually is possible between now and the end of the year? You know what I mean?
No, that's a great question to ask and to keep on pushing that boundary, right? Like I said, this is like you ask somebody, do you think that this goal is realistic of $500,000? Yeah. Okay. What about $1 million? Wow. Now, $1 million is going to be hard, but do you think it's possible? Yes. Okay. What about 5 million? Right. And then you'll get to that point for whatever reason where they go, yo.
That's because they know their own constraints, whether it's their situation or their own mind, you know? And so you're hitting the level of their constraints, not anyone, not objective constraints.
They could be objective, right? They could be, okay, that level of achievement is just not possible. And, some people can tolerate getting very close to that physical limit and others can't tolerate it at all. There has to be a lot of buffer for them to get into the emotional state to be willing to commit.
So Dr. Bernard, will you please tell in simple terms the Ernie Els story and about why you honestly can't negotiate well for yourself?
If you think about professional golfers, right, they earn a lot of money, right? They have contracts at tens of millions of dollars from sponsors. They go and appear for a golfing event and they can get, $500,000, $1 million for just an appearance. And I had the opportunity to sit down and speak to Ernie Els, which is one of the top professional golfers in the world. And I said to him, I have this challenge of being able to get fees that matches the type of value that we deliver. And of course, you have to be personally confident that you can deliver that value. And you need somebody else on the other side that's buying from you that perceive the value. But why is it so hard? Why for both sides, right? And he said to me, you can't do it yourself. You need a manager or an agent, somebody that can say to you, listen, Dr. Benjamin Hardy, for example, is one of the leaders in his field. He charges, unfortunately, for a day. He charges, his fee is $100,000. You have to make sure that the problem that you're asking to help you with is worth at least $1 million, 10x that. The same with him. He said, he would feel massively uncomfortable if a charity phoned up and said, Ernie, we'd like you to be the special guest of honor for our charity golfing event. And to say to them, which is a charity, my fee is going to be $100,000 for the day or $500,000 for the day. Make sure that you capitalize on that. Make sure that you can monetize to get at least 2x, 5x, 10x that. Else, it's not worth having me there. That's a kind of discussion that only a manager or an agent can have. I think it would be very uncomfortable, not just for the star, but also for the other side to hear the star sort of selling himself like that. I think it's just very awkward and uncomfortable for both sides.
Why is it either awkward or uncomfortable, either for the other person to see the star selling themselves or even for the star to sell themselves? Why is it difficult from both sides for it to be that way?
I take myself, for example. It's like if I was sitting down like that, it just feels to me like this is too much. So even though
Are you talking about this is too much when you're thinking about the money itself?
Yeah, the money itself, right? It just feels like uncomfortable to talk about those numbers. I think on the other side, it's the same thing. It's like when you hear somebody selling themselves at that level, it's hard not to think about, wow, they really must think a lot about themselves.
But if it's an agent or if it's someone else, it feels more like it's a product versus a person. Yeah. Is that what it is?
Exactly. I think that's a great way of actually putting it. It's like I'm selling really a product. I'm selling their availability to you. It's your job to make sure that you can fully monetize that to get a 2x, 5x, 10x return from that.
I guess two questions on this. One is to the confidence piece. You talking about how it just feels, you're talking about your own emotions, you're talking about your own beliefs and your own perceptions. Is there any thoughts you have on you changing your own emotional relationship or your own affect towards that so that for you, it's not uncomfortable. You know that you're overvaluing. You actually fully believe you're giving them a freaking bargain.
Yeah, I that's a great question. I get that confidence when I go back into the numbers, right? It's like, okay, we're starting this project. It's a $10 billion company, right? We tend to think that with these type of companies, we can probably help them to increase their output between 5 and 10%. That would be the range that we would be targeting for no significant increase in OPEX and CAPEX, right? So on a 10 billion company, now we're talking about a 500 million to $1 billion of increased revenue. And if you can do that with the same...
Over 12 months or over what?
Yeah, over a 12-month period. If you can do that with the same OPEX and CAPEX, right, whatever your gross margin is, will drop to the bottom line. So if your total variable cost is, say, 50%, then of that 500 million, $250 million will hit their bottom line, right? So that's the hard numbers that I go through. And then what I do is to say, but let's think of, that is our range. But what would a 1%, like right at the bottom of my worst case benefit, right? What would that number look like? It's 100 million. 1% of 10 billion is $100 million. That's $50 million increase in your net profit. So if I'm quoting you $1 million for the project, it's a 50x return in the same financial year, right? If I quote you 10 million, right, you can see. So getting back down to that level of basics, right? It's like just going through the numbers, trying to take the emotions out of it. That's my own way of getting over that sort of, wow, this is a big number. You know, I just feel so uncomfortable to share the number that it's worth at least $1 million and probably worth 5 million or maybe even 10 million, because at 10 million, they're still getting 5x returns, you know?
One of the things I think about, if I am that big company and I'm thinking about hiring you and you can show me that, you know, it's going to be a 50x return, even at the absolute worst case scenario, I think that the thing that they probably are thinking about is, do we even know that we want to implement what you're saying? Like, we believe that you can get us 1 to 10%, but are we willing to do what you want us to do to get there? What's the cost of doing it with you versus the cost, you know, could someone else get us, you know, even if they get us a same percentage, they're going to, maybe their strategies or their ideas are more in alignment with what we think we can actually accomplish. Or, yeah, I don't know. I wonder how how you set it up so that people see that, like, no, this is unique. This is something that's doable. This is like, so that you honestly become like the only option where they're like, this is exactly what I want to do.
I think where you also right is pricing is all about psychology, like you said. You know, it's the next step then is, once you've shown that the value is there, that the worst case benefit, right, in this case it would be $50 million, would still be much, much greater than the worst case cost, which might be 5 million, right? So let's say we're trying to think about a way of going from charging $1 million for the service, which will give us good margins, but it's nowhere close to the leverage that we should be able to generate with that amount of benefits. Is then to think about the next part of that is, what could block them from seeing that as an absolutely unrefusable offer, as an irresistible offer. And I think that's the other part that really skilled salespeople have, is they have that intuition to probe, to find out what's the real cause for them not to buy. There could be cases which I've had where the person that's making the decision, maybe it's a serial entrepreneur, there's a blockage for them in paying an external party more than $1 million. They just think $1 million is fair, and I don't care if I'm going to get 100 million or $300 million worth of value. I just think that $1 million is fair. And that's hard to overcome when they have that very strong sense of fairness versus unfairness. You know, it has nothing to do with value anymore. It's about fairness. If it's another type of thing, which is, I'm so terrified in my type of environment to make a commitment of the potential benefit to that order of magnitude, I'm just terrified in doing that.
Oh,
So
because they're also terrified of their own commitment level to the goal. And if
Right.
they make that level of investment, then they feel like they've got to increase their commitment to the goal. And they don't know if they want to be that committed.
What if they're going to be held accountable, not just from a perspective of, what if we don't deliver the 1%, right? What if I was able to convince them that 1% is almost a given? We really feel, but imagine them standing in front of the board saying that we're contracting with these guys. They're going to charge us $5 million, but they're going to deliver $50 million minimum to our bottom line. And somebody goes, when last has anybody delivered $50 million to our bottom line? We've been stuck at, $50 million for a long time, right? Up and down, we're like at 50 million. You're telling me these guys are going to come in here and double our profits, right? In 12 months? Like, are we such idiots? That type of discussion is, and of course, what you do is you imagine yourself standing in front of the board having to defend this, right? So now it's no longer, well, actually, they were pretty convincing that they can probably do 5 to 10%. Now I'm starting to find it difficult to even justify 1% because it's a huge number. And then, like, how do I answer this question? Like, are we stupid? Like, can't we do it this ourselves? We haven't been able to, right? So there, what I've realized is unless you give them a compelling reason of why this was not possible before, it's very likely that you will trigger that response. And I suspect, especially in a corporate environment, that's probably one of the top, if not the top reason why it's so hard to get big contracts, is for that fear of being kind of exposed as a non-expert. What I'm starting to feel more and more comfortable, just from a personal perspective in terms of the service that we offer, the type of problems that we solve is so complex that it's pretty easy to show that they cannot solve it with the current level of technology and thinking that they have. It's not possible. And that's the reason why they're stuck. They're stuck in exactly the same place as their competitors are. It's just a really, really hard problem to solve. There's so many options, and most of them will make it worse and not better. If you're selling a technology that you can convincingly show the client that before getting access to your technology or your knowledge, it wasn't possible for them to solve it, I think that's a way of overcoming that psychological bias. Interesting thing, getting back to the question about perception of value, we almost expect information to be free today, especially with, like, if you imagine ChatGPT has just taken that to another level. I mean, it's so hard to differentiate between the signal and the noise, right? There's a lot of noise out there, a lot of data, but not good information. I love my mentor, Dr. Eli Goldratt's, his definition of information. What's the difference between data and information? He asked. And he said, information is the answer to your question. So that's the difference. You can't build an information system without knowing what's the question you're trying to answer, right? So you can imagine if you're trying to add value to an organization, your first thing is what is the real question they should be asking you? It's not what question they have, it's what's the question they should be asking you. Because they often ask the wrong question.
How do you help them start to even consider the question that they should be asking?
Yeah, I think that's where the Socratic approach comes in, and your experience in a specific industry. Having enough experience that you realize that unless they get an answer to this question, nothing else really matters. If you think about the concept of the one thing, right? It's a one thing that if you don't solve that, nothing else matters. So knowing where the constraint is in the system often helps you to figure out what's the right question. But I think that there's other frameworks as well, like the one I shared about anti-fragility, right? You want a mechanism that allows you to limit the pain of a negative stress or downside or failure, but you also need a mechanism that allows you to fully capitalize on the full upside of a positive stress. So if you think about that, like, what's your key question? Well, there's two questions. The first one is, how can I limit the pain of a big downturn? Because that can wipe me out, right? You think about an Uber, a type of an Uber situation. If they owned all the cars and they owned all the drivers, a relatively small dip in the economy could wipe them out because suddenly they can't make their loan repayments and they run out of cash. That was their first thing, is how do we create a business model that protects us from downside risk? But that doesn't allow the company to grow, doesn't allow the company to very quickly scale when they need to. So they needed the mechanism of surge pricing, of how do I fully capitalize on a positive stress when demand exceeds supply? What if we increase the prices automatically? Where do we stop? Well, there should be no stop. That's when people start rejecting the service, that's when you stop. So you start off with not 5% increase or 10%, but you've seen those where it could be 4 times as much. My normal trip, from my home to the Las Vegas airport is like $30, but I've paid up to $120 because in that moment, there's just not enough cars. So what they basically do is they increase the price until you say, look, there's a cost of having the car and then there's a cost of not having the car. And the cost of not having it is I'm going to be late for my flight, right? Okay. And it also helps to sort out the priorities. Like if I'm sitting there and I don't need to be at the airport right now, I have a bit of a buffer. I can be there in the next hour. I can have a look at this and say, $120 is crazy. I'll wait until it comes down. And I know it will come down when the spike goes down. So that to me is like, that's the next question. You can imagine working with this business and sitting down with the owners and asking them like, what's your question? So we need frameworks to help us figure out like, what is the question? Like if the framework is, well, where's your constraint currently? Oh, it's in the market. So the question really is, how do you get customers to be willing to pay more, buy more frequently? Jay Abraham's question, right? Nothing else matters. My interest is so much on the emotional side. It's like, it's all psychology ultimately, right? So that to me is like a fascinating thing, is this mix between, emotions, logic, and intuition. Goldratt talked about this magical link between these. He said that if you think about how they relate to each other, intuition, logic, and emotions. And his claim was that, yes, they are all interrelated. There's not always a kind of a serial causal connection between them. But when you think about, if you are really passionate about something, a lot of emotions about a specific subject matter. That's going to give you the energy that you need in order to go and study it. And the more you study it, the more you develop some intuition. And the more intuition you develop, the more you can check the logic, right? And the more you get feedback from, now the logic is checking out, I'm starting to get results, the more emotion it gives you. So there's that. Sometimes it goes from emotion to logic, from emotion to intuition, but there's this really fascinating connection between those 3 things. And that's something I would love to explore with you, and writing an article or maybe even a little short book about it.
Aside from theory of constraints, are there any other primary models or theories that you use for making decisions, simplifying processes? What I would say is creating exponential growth.
So I think probably the other one, there's a couple of frameworks that I use, but the framework from Nassim Taleb about anti-fragility.